March 2007. A heavy atmosphere enveloped the east shore of Canyon Ferry Lake as the water level receded to its lowest in decades, exposing stretches of mud untouched for nearly half a century. The beam from search and rescue officer Rick Halvorsen's flashlight cut through the thin morning mist, illuminating a large piece of metal protruding from the mud like a secret struggling to break free. Center, I need backup at Canyon Ferry, and get the forensics team here right away. We may have found the vehicle. His voice echoed and then dissolved into the silent void around the lake. What had begun as a routine water level check had now become something entirely different. Something that would answer the haunting questions that had plagued the town of Townsend for 47 years. A 1956 Ford submerged deep in the lake bed, and inside the cabin was an embroidered handkerchief with the initials E.W., the item Eleanor Witford had carried with her on the night she vanished in 1959. For nearly half a century, Eleanor's disappearance had been nothing but a series of unanswered questions. A young gentlewoman who suddenly vanished from her wooden home after a quiet evening, leaving behind 2 sleeping children and a husband who claimed he didn't know where she had gone. An empty chair at every family dinner. A bedroom kept exactly as it was for years, as if she might return at any moment. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, take a second to subscribe and like the video. Your support helps bring forgotten cases back into the light and ensures the algorithm doesn't miss the next one. The discovery of the car at the bottom of the lake was not just the end of a missing person case. It was the first domino in a chain of events that would unearth secrets buried under layers of Montana mud for decades. Because when authorities finally identified a suspect and made an arrest in 2007, it wasn't a stranger or an anonymous predator. It was someone the Townsend community knew by name, trusted, and had lived among them for 47 years while carrying a horrifying secret. The Witford case is not just a mystery solved. It is proof of the persistence of children who grew up refusing to let their mother disappear in silence, of investigators who refused to let the file gather dust, and of forensic science which finally gave a voice back to a Montana woman who had been silenced for far too long. This is also the story of a community torn apart. When Eleanor vanished in 1959, suspicion spread through Townsend like wildfire on dry grass. Neighbors whispered about one another. Families stopped speaking. The search for Eleanor exposed the cracks that had long simmered in this small town, and those cracks would split wide open when the truth was finally revealed after 47 years. What makes this case especially haunting is that the answer had always been so close. The prime suspect had been interviewed in the initial investigation, but still slipped through the net. For decades, this person attended prayer vigils for Eleanor, stood beside her family, looked them straight in the eye, while maintaining an appearance of complete innocence. Where are you watching this video from today? Drop your location in the comments. I'm always curious to see where these cold case stories reach across America. Tonight, we will walk through the final hours of June 1959, trace the nearly half-century-long investigation, and uncover the earth-shattering turning point that brought Eleanor's truth rising up from the mud of Canyon Ferry Lake. This is a story of loss, persistence, deception, and finally, justice delayed but never denied. Townsend, Montana, in 1959, was a small town surrounded by vast fields and distant gray-green mountain ranges, where life moved slowly in rhythm with the seasons. Canyon Ferry Lake and unpaved dirt roads. The Witford family lived in a 2-story wooden house on the edge of town. Eleanor, 28 years old, a woman known to many for her calm demeanor, Harold, her husband, who worked at a machinery repair shop, and their 2 young daughters who shared a room upstairs. The evening before Eleanor disappeared unfolded like any ordinary evening in town. The sky darkened early and quietly. Light from the downstairs window spilled into the backyard, the radio playing softly inside the house. However, sometime after 9 p.m., a neighbor living not far away reported unusual sounds coming from the Witford house, louder than normal voices. The sound of objects being moved, followed by a prolonged silence. The last time Eleanor was seen was when she went downstairs after tucking the 2 children into bed, stepping into the ground floor where the living room light was still on. No one knows what happened after that moment. The next morning, as the sun rose above the mountain ridge and pale light filtered through the kitchen window, Harold discovered Eleanor was no longer in the house. Her coat still hung on the hook by the door. The bed showed no sign of anyone having returned during the night. He walked around the property, checked the backyard, the shed, the path leading to the forest trail, but found no indication that Eleanor had left the house in any normal way. The 2 children were still asleep and had heard no strange noises during the night. The family, based on Eleanor's habits and the fact that she hadn't taken any essential items, concluded that the possibility of her leaving voluntarily was virtually impossible. After searching around the house without finding any trace, Harold went door to door to the neighbors, hoping Eleanor might have stopped by during the night or asked someone for help. But everyone said they hadn't seen her. As every reasonable possibility was gradually ruled out, and Eleanor's absence stretched on unusually long, worry quickly turned into real fear. By late morning, Harold decided to contact the local police and report his wife, Eleanor Witford, missing. When the report reached the Townsend police station, Sheriff Tom Larrabee and Deputy Earl Maddox immediately headed to the Witford home to verify the situation. The wooden house still held the quiet of a Montana morning, but Eleanor's absence created an unmistakable sense of unease right from the entrance. The officers checked the ground floor, the backyard, and the entire surrounding area, noting that there were no signs the victim had left the house prepared. Her coat was still hanging in place, shoes undisturbed, and no personal items missing, something unusual for a woman who always carried her purse whenever she went out. After confirming the victim was truly not present at the scene, Sheriff Tom began collecting the basic information needed to open a file. Harold described Eleanor as average height, petite build, dark brown hair, last seen wearing a light-colored sweater as she went downstairs the previous evening. Regarding vehicles, Harold stated that the family owned an old blue 1956 Ford, usually parked on the lot next to the house. But that morning, the car was also missing from its usual spot. When asked about the last time he saw Eleanor, Harold maintained that he had gone to bed first and didn't know when his wife left the house. Police noted the weather conditions the previous night: low temperatures, strong winds blowing in from the lake, and dry ground that could easily erase traces due to wind. These factors were assessed as potentially affecting the ability to find signs of the victim's movement if she had left the house during the night. During the initial statement, Harold said he hadn't heard anything unusual after going to bed and only discovered Eleanor missing in the morning. This was recorded as his first version of events fully documented by police for later comparison. In a preliminary assessment of voluntary disappearance, Sheriff Tom compared Harold's statement with what he observed at the scene. Eleanor hadn't taken her coat, hadn't taken her purse, and hadn't prepared any items necessary for leaving the house at night. Moreover, the low outdoor temperature made walking without warm clothing unlikely. Police concluded that the scenario of the victim leaving prepared was highly improbable. At the same time, they noted there were no clear signs of criminal activity at the scene. With the initial findings recorded, authorities quickly determined this was a high-risk missing person case and needed immediate search deployment that same day. Sheriff Tom promptly notified the coordination unit to prepare personnel, topographic maps, and key areas based on Harold's statement and locations Eleanor might normally go under ordinary circumstances. Although no specific leads existed yet, Eleanor's unusual absence combined with the cold night weather led law enforcement to conclude this was a situation that could not be delayed. That same afternoon, Eleanor Witford's missing person file was officially opened and the search force activated, marking the beginning of an investigation process that would stretch across decades to come. Immediately afterward, Sheriff Tom Larrabee and Deputy Earl Maddox returned to the temporary headquarters set up in the Witford living room to move into the next phase of handling a high-risk missing person case. The first task was to establish a reasonable search perimeter based on the 1959 Townsend terrain: vast open land, sparse population, many dirt roads leading into the forest, and considerable distance from the Witford house to major thoroughfares. They spread a large map across the kitchen table, marked the house location, and began defining search radii in concentric circles. The first circle extended 2 miles, corresponding to the distance an adult could walk on a cold night without gear or transportation. The second expanded to 5 miles, including trails leading toward the edge of Gallatin Forest and abandoned lands north of town. The third reached 8 miles, encompassing dirt roads stretching to scattered small farms and hunter trails commonly used during hunting season. These 3 circles became the standard search framework for deploying forces in the first 24 hours. After defining the perimeter, Sheriff Tom contacted support units. The Broadwater County Sheriff's Office sent 2 additional officers. Gallatin Rangers dispatched 3 experienced deep forest guides. A volunteer group of farmers, ranchers, and local hunters signed up upon hearing of Eleanor's disappearance. Townsend being a small town, word spread quickly and mobilizing manpower was not difficult, but the challenge lay in organizing people with varied skills into an orderly search system. Sheriff Tom assigned one group to focus on the trail behind the Witford house, considered the most logical direction if the victim left on foot. The second group swept open land and backyards of neighboring homes, looking for any signs of movement or dropped items. The third group went deeper into the forest edge, where the terrain was steep and easy to become disoriented in the dark. In addition to dividing the search areas, police needed to establish Eleanor's movement habits to predict the most likely directions. Harold was asked to provide details on places Eleanor commonly visited: the general store in Townsend, her sister's house a few miles away, the road toward Canyon Ferry Lake, though she rarely went there in the evening. Any habit of the victim that might suggest a route was marked on the map with specific symbols. Neighbors were also asked whether Eleanor often walked in the evenings. Most answers were no, as she usually stayed home with the children after dark. These small pieces of information helped police rule out unlikely directions and focus on higher value areas. Weather and terrain were carefully considered: cold, strong winds, dry ground, easily erased tracks, and nighttime travel without light something a cautious person like Eleanor would find very difficult. All these facts reinforce the view that if Eleanor had left the house, it was not a deliberate action or part of her routine. Once the search plan was finalized, Sheriff Tom required radial contact between groups, set periodic check-in times, and assigned someone to log all activities according to high-risk missing person standards. Before the teams dispersed to their assigned directions, he reviewed the map once more, boldly marking intersections between trails in complex terrain areas, places where the victim could have encountered trouble as she passed through. The search structure was tightly established, suited to 1959 conditions when support equipment was limited, and every trace, no matter how small, needed immediate documentation upon discovery. At the end of the planning phase, the entire force was ready to launch a systematic search to locate Eleanor Witford in the shortest possible time frame. Right after the search plan was established, the assigned teams deployed the initial phase near the Witford house, focusing on the backyard, the trail leading into the forest, and the open land surrounding the property. This was the highest probability area for identifying initial movement traces if Eleanor had left the house during the night, as any footprints, dropped items, or unusual ground changes could provide critical clues for the next direction. The first team, consisting of Deputy Earl Maddox and 3 volunteers, swept the entire backyard, starting from the back door step and fanning out to cover every possible direction. The morning ground was hard and dry, with a thin layer of dust on the surface showing minor disturbances but no distinct shapes. Team members quickly noted this and confirmed with Sheriff Tom that the previous night's weather-strong winds from the lake could have blurred or completely erased any footprints made during the night. An overall ground survey showed no clear signs of someone passing through in haste or distress. The second team, including 1 ranger and 2 experienced hunters, surveyed the trail leading from behind the house into the edge of Gallatin Forest. This was a path commonly used by locals, making it difficult to distinguish new from old tracks without clear visual indicators like heavily disturbed soil or freshly broken branches. Along nearly half a mile of trail, they only noted faint traces that could not be confirmed as human or small animal. Dry branches lying on the ground could have been caused by wind or nighttime animal movement, with no unusual signs in break direction, freshness, or force of impact. Based on ranger experience, they determined there were no indications that an adult had entered the forest that night with erratic steps or abnormal speed. Meanwhile, Sheriff Tom deployed a scent-tracking dog team from a neighboring county, using a sample of Eleanor's clothing for the dogs to pick up the scent and focus on 2 areas, the backyard and the trail. However, after more than an hour of searching, the dogs detected no strong scent leading in any specific direction. They showed a mild reaction at the back door step, where Eleanor obviously passed daily. But as they moved farther into the yard and trail, the scent trail completely vanished. This result made the search more difficult. As in missing person cases, the presence or absence of a scent trail is a key factor in determining whether the victim left the house on foot. The rangers analyzed that the strong winds and low temperatures the previous night could have dispersed the scent faster than usual. But the possibility that the victim did not leave via the back trail could not be ruled out. The survey team continued expanding the backyard search, including the area around the shed and the wooden fence. Every item, such as a handkerchief, purse, shoes, or any small belonging of Eleanor's, was confirmed absent from the scene, with no signs of scattering, dragging, or scraping on the ground. The absence of any personal evidence reinforced the assessment that if Eleanor had left the house, it was not in a state of panic or injury that would cause items to be left behind. In cases where a missing person leaves voluntarily in a distracted mental state, they often leave abnormal signs with belongings or even forget essential items. However, here the scene remained orderly, showing no signs of uncontrolled action. In addition, The search team checked the well area, the land near the eastern fence, and the small path to the nearest neighbor's house. Some minor marks appeared on the dusty ground, but when compared for size, shoe pattern, and depth, they were likely from Harold or neighbors moving that morning before the search force arrived. With no new distinct shapes, no long drag marks or grooves indicating stumbling, investigators could not identify any trace related to Eleanor. At the conclusion of the first search phase, Sheriff Tom recorded all observations in the report. No clear scent trail from the dogs, no definitive ground tracks, no personal items left behind, and no visual evidence that Eleanor moved through the backyard or trail on the night she disappeared. Although no specific leads were obtained, this outcome held significant value for determining the next search direction, as it indicated two possibilities. Either Eleanor did not leave the house on foot via the back, or if she did move, all traces had been erased by the weather in a short time. The lack of any decisive evidence caused the initial search phase to end in caution, but also opened the need to expand the perimeter to broader areas, where further analysis of the possibility that the victim left by vehicle or in a different direction beyond the back trail would be required. The initial search phase yielded no clear traces, forcing Sheriff Tom and Deputy Earl to shift focus to assessing the realistic possibilities of Eleanor's movement on the night she disappeared, considering both foot travel and vehicle use. They began by analyzing the likelihood that Eleanor left the house on foot despite the absence of any supporting evidence in the backyard. Eleanor's daily habits were reviewed through statements from Harold and neighbors. She rarely went out in the evenings, let alone walked in cold, windy weather. Eleanor had no history of long nighttime walks, did not participate in evening activities outside town limits, and had no specific reason to leave the house without telling anyone. When cross-referenced with the Phase 1 search report, no scent trail, no dropped items, no fresh footprints, the possibility of the victim leaving voluntarily on foot became extremely low. To reinforce this assessment, police also noted the previous night's weather conditions. Strong winds blowing in from the lake could erase tracks, but would make it difficult to completely obliterate all footprints if Eleanor had walked any significant distance on dry ground. The complete lack of signs within several dozen yards around the house further suggested the victim may not have walked out of the property at all that night. As the foot travel scenario grew increasingly improbable, Sheriff Tom turned to evaluating the possibility that Eleanor drove away. Harold was questioned again about the location of the 1956 Ford the previous evening. His initial statement claimed the car was parked on the lot next to the house, with no indication Eleanor had used it. However, when pressed further about his wife's driving habits, Harold admitted Eleanor disliked driving at night due to dim streetlights, rough dirt roads, and limited visibility, but she could still drive when necessary. This differed from his first account, making this the second version of his statement, which police clearly documented for later comparison. With the hypothesis that Eleanor used the vehicle, police began checking the main routes leading out of Townsend. Though a small town, there were three plausible directions: south toward the main road to Helena, north into farm roads, and east toward Canyon Ferry Lake, an area locals frequently visited for fishing or picnics. These routes were test-driven by police to assess travel times, nighttime terrain difficulty, and whether Eleanor could realistically have driven them. However, if she drove, the most critical question remained: why? Police found no evidence suggesting Eleanor had urgent business outside at night or that anyone had arranged to meet her. Meanwhile, the route toward the lake drew particular attention. Canyon Ferry Lake was a place locals might go for night fishing or pass through on small trails, but Eleanor had no habit of going there in the evening. Still, Sheriff Tom noted that if Eleanor had left the house voluntarily or met someone, the lake direction still warranted checking due to its open terrain, sparse houses, and relatively high risk of an incident. New information emerged when a resident living near the dirt road area west of the lake reported to police that the previous night, sometime after 10 p.m., he saw a brief flash of vehicle headlights on a short stretch of trail heading toward the lake bed. He could not identify the vehicle type, but confirmed the lights were low intensity, similar to the old headlights on 1950s-era cars. The witness heard no loud noises or unusual engine sounds, but the appearance of headlights at an uncommon hour made police treat this as a significant piece of data. When Deputy Earl questioned Harold about this, Harold showed hesitation before changing his statement for the second time. Instead of insisting Eleanor could not have driven out at night, he said she might have taken the car if she wanted to go out and think. This was a significant shift from his original description that Eleanor had not left and the car remained in place. It increased the likelihood that the victim may have left by vehicle, though the voluntary or involuntary nature remained unclear. Police continued examining the dirt parking area next to the house where the 1956 Ford was usually kept. The ground there was dry and subject to strong winds, so any tire tracks from the previous night were very likely blurred or erased by morning. It was impossible to definitively determine whether the car had moved. Some minor disturbances appeared on the surface, but were neither deep nor sharp enough to conclude the vehicle had been driven. Combining the facts, Eleanor had no habit of nighttime walking, no footprints around the house, no scent trail, husband's changing statements. Witness seeing vehicle lights near the lake. Sheriff Tom concluded that if Eleanor left the house, it was most likely by car, heading toward Canyon Ferry Lake. In the interim report, he explicitly listed the factors directing the search toward the lake. The route aligned with the witness's observation time frame. Eleanor was capable of driving even if she rarely did, and the 1956 Ford was not found in its usual spot. At the end of the analysis phase, the investigation shifted to verifying access points to Canyon Ferry Lake, assessing vehicle-accessible terrain, and preparing to expand a search along the route deemed most probable on the night Eleanor Witford disappeared. The shift in search focus to Canyon Ferry Lake was implemented that same afternoon, with Sheriff Tom and Deputy Earl leading a search team consisting of Gallatin Rangers, local hunters, and 2 support officers to expand coverage along the dirt road leading down to the water's edge. The terrain around the lake featured many gentle slopes, open patches interspersed with low grass clumps, and loose gravel areas easily erased by wind, making it difficult to evaluate nighttime vehicle or pedestrian movement. The first team moved along the main dirt road, checking temporary parking spots where people sometimes left vehicles for fishing or breaks. No Ford was spotted, only minor ground disturbances that did not form clear tire patterns. Ranger Hollister noted that under strong wind and loose soil conditions, tire tracks might remain only as faint impressions, insufficient to identify vehicle type or timing. The second team swept the lakeside in an arc pattern, focusing on low-lying areas that could serve as vehicle access points if a car had moved close to the water. There, they noticed a narrow strip of grass pushed aside as if something heavy had passed through. But the mark was not clear enough to determine whether it was caused by a vehicle or by locals previously gathering fishing gear. As they moved deeper into the low grass, a volunteer discovered a small piece of blue fabric caught among grass roots. The piece was only a few inches long, with no distinctive pattern, but the color matched the description of the light coat Harold said Eleanor had worn a few days before disappearing. Sheriff Tom immediately ordered the fabric collected as evidence, numbered and sealed per protocol, while marking the discovery location on the search map. However, due to weathering and fading, the fabric could not yet be confirmed as belonging to Eleanor or left by someone else using the path in prior days. While the lakeside group continued searching, Deputy Earl coordinated with Ranger Hollister to survey a small branching dirt road heading south. In an area with slightly damper soil, they recorded a compressed strip matching tire width, but the depth was too shallow to determine direction. Some sections showed curvature but quickly faded as the ground turned to fine sand. Hollister assessed that this track could not be considered decisive evidence because many vehicles might have passed through, especially fishermen or small trucks, using the trail to reach the lake. Still, he noted the faint track appeared fresher than long-dried ruts, though strong winds from the previous evening made any firm conclusion nearly impossible. An important addition from Hollister was that early the morning after Eleanor's disappearance, he had seen fresh disturbances on a previously flat stretch of ground, as if a vehicle had driven through before the wind fully erased the marks. He could not identify the vehicle type, but the compression pattern suggested an older model with narrow tires, consistent with the 1950s era. This detail was added to the search report as a reference factor, though still lacking conclusive value. While the trail team surveyed, the third search team moved along the water's edge, looking for any washed-up or snagged personal items near shore, but found nothing beyond some rotted wood and water-deposited trash. The absence of Eleanor's personal items, handkerchief, purse, shoes made it difficult for police to confirm whether she had ever been in the area, but the discovery of the blue fabric fragment at this point prevented them from entirely ruling out the possibility that the victim had been near the lake. When compiling the day's results, Sheriff Tom recorded, no vehicle located, no personal items beyond the unverified blue fabric, no clear footprints, faint tire tracks possibly from multiple vehicles, possible second vehicle appearance early morning per Ranger Hollister's observation. These facts did not produce a definitive investigative lead, but were sufficient to sustain the hypothesis that Eleanor or her car may have been near Canyon Ferry Lake that night or early the following morning. The lack of clear visual evidence did not diminish the area's value. On the contrary, it underscored the need to expand the search to other lake access routes and locations where a vehicle might have stopped or departed in darkness before traces were erased by weather. After the lake area search produced no clear leads beyond the blue fabric fragment and ambiguous faint tire tracks, Sheriff Tom decided to temporarily shift focus to gathering witness statements to strengthen or eliminate possibilities related to the timing of Eleanor's departure. The nearest neighbor, Mrs. Florence Cobb, stated that on the evening Eleanor disappeared, she heard loud voices coming from the Witford house sometime after 9 p.m. According to her, the volume was higher than the usual household sounds she had heard from the family, but she could not distinguish content or confirm whether it was an argument or just radio noise. About 10 minutes later, she heard a loud door slam loud enough to make her pause while washing dishes. This timing aligned with the last sighting of Eleanor as reported by her husband, so police recorded it as a valuable timestamp. Another witness living 2 houses away, Mr. Tam Dale Marin, stated that around 10 p.m., while taking his dog out to the yard, he heard a car door close, followed by an engine starting for a few seconds before abruptly shutting off. He did not see headlights because his view was blocked by large trees in his yard, but the sound seemed quite close, possibly from the Witford backyard or the adjacent dirt road. No one else in the area reported similar noises, but given Townsend's small size and limited nighttime activity, any mechanical sound stood out. These statements were immediately incorporated by Sheriff Tom into a tentative timeline of the disappearance night, with witnesses confirming unusual sounds both inside the house and from a vehicle around the time Eleanor vanished. Police returned for a second interview with Harold. In this session, Harold provided a third version of his statement markedly different from the previous 2. Whereas he had earlier claimed he went to bed early and did not know when Eleanor left, this time he said his wife might have stepped out to the backyard after an unpleasant conversation about weekly spending. When asked about the loud door slam heard by the neighbor, he suggested it could have been the wind slamming the loosely hinged back door. But when confronted with the timing matching Mr. Marin's report of a car door and engine, Harold appeared flustered and added that Eleanor might have gone to the car to retrieve something, though he did not remember clearly because he was already sleepy. This was a significant shift in his account, as Harold had never previously mentioned Eleanor going to the car that night. The change prompted police to classify Harold's statements as unstable over time, requiring closer scrutiny and subsequent steps. When asked whether Eleanor often used the car at night, Harold replied that she almost never did, but he could not explain why the Ford was not in its usual parking spot the next morning. This inconsistency was noted in the interrogation report, as it suggested the possibility that Eleanor may have driven away or that the car was moved by someone else during a period Harold did not notice. In addition to collecting statements from the disappearance night, police examined the level of family discord based on information from relatives and neighbors. Miss Crucial Florence stated that the Witford family generally appeared harmonious, though she had overheard arguments a few times, mostly in the evenings after Harold returned late from work. A cousin of Eleanor's, when interviewed, said Eleanor had seemed stressed in recent conversations but did not specify the reason. Police did not view this as evidence of serious conflict, but recorded it as supporting data for assessing family context. No one reported violence or threats, but no one could firmly assert that Eleanor faced no pressure before disappearing. These statements were filtered and organized by relevance to the disappearance timing, with particular focus on 3 elements: loud sounds inside the house, car door and engine noises, and Harold's changing statements when confronted with witness information. At the conclusion of the witness statement phase, Sheriff Tom determined that although there was no direct proof Eleanor left with a vehicle, the neighbor statements and Harold's inconsistencies strengthened the hypothesis that significant activity, both human and vehicular, occurred around the house that evening. This indicated the need to continue expanding the investigation and closely examine routes related to vehicle movement on the night of the incident. After gathering witness statements and noting the ongoing changes in Harold's account, Sheriff Tom moved to the phase of reviewing Eleanor's personal and financial records to determine whether any signs indicated she had prepared to leave voluntarily. The review began with items Eleanor regularly used: wallet, purse, identification papers, notebook, and small belongings relatives said she always carried when leaving home. All of these were found in the cabinet by the front door or in the downstairs bedroom, arranged in their usual places. Eleanor's wallet still contained a normal amount of cash consistent with her weekly spending. Identification, driver's license, store cards, and recent receipts remained intact in the purse. No items had been removed or set aside in preparation for leaving that night. A quick inventory of clothing in the closet showed Eleanor had taken nothing beyond the outfit she was last seen wearing, and even her coat, an almost essential item for going out in cold weather, remained hanging by the back door. Personal correspondence was also examined, including postcards from relatives, bills, and family notes. None expressed intent to leave town, meet someone at night, or change her life. Personal notes showed a clear routine with no signs of mental instability leading to sudden departure. Moving to financial review, Sheriff Tom gathered information from the local bank and the general store where Eleanor usually shopped. Last month's transactions showed steady spending, groceries, household items, a few children's things with no unusual amounts, such as deposits, large transfers, or purchases inconsistent with her habits. In the week before disappearing, Eleanor made only 2 small transactions, both for daily needs. There were no sudden withdrawals, no signs of preparing for a long trip or special purchases. Unlike voluntary departures, Eleanor had not gathered belongings, withdrawn money, contacted friends, or prepared transportation. Even checking her sewing supply account at the store showed no interruptions or unusual changes in routine. All data indicated a high degree of stability in her life right up to the disappearance. Police continued questioning relatives and friends about Eleanor's travel habits. She usually stayed home evenings caring for her 2 young children and did not leave alone after dark. Eleanor had no close friends. She regularly met late in the day, did not participate in evening community activities, and did not use the car at night except for emergencies like taking a child to medical care. Recent conversations with her cousin and a few acquaintances showed Eleanor living quietly, with no signs of dissatisfaction or desire for major change. Discussions about family spending had occurred, but were not serious enough to cause her to leave immediately. When synthesizing this information, Sheriff Tom assessed the likelihood of Eleanor voluntarily leaving the house on the night she disappeared as extremely low. Not taking her wallet, papers, coat, not withdrawing money, and leaving no signs of preparation all contradicted any deliberate departure. Even in emotionally driven departures, victims tend to take at least some essentials. But here the scene showed none of that. The habit assessment summary was entered into the case file with 2 key conclusions. First, Eleanor had no personal, financial, or emotional reason to leave town voluntarily. Second, leaving at a late night hour ran counter to all her habits and living conditions. These facts reinforce the view that Eleanor did not leave the house on her own initiative the night she disappeared, and if any movement occurred, the motive did not originate from the victim. Concluding voluntary departure as extremely unlikely became a crucial foundation for adjusting the search and investigation strategy in the following steps. The review of Eleanor's personal and financial records confirmed almost certainly that she did not leave the house voluntarily, and this forced Sheriff Tom to expand the search scale to the entire town and the remote areas surrounding Townsend. The third search phase was regarded as the most critical step in the first 48 hours of a high-risk missing person case, because if Eleanor or the 1956 Ford had ever left the vicinity of the house, traces would most likely appear along the routes connecting the town to surrounding regions. Police coordinated with Gallatin Rangers to propose using a local light aircraft for aerial observation. The propeller plane was dispatched from a small airport a few miles from Townsend, flying in an expanding spiral pattern starting from the Witford property and gradually extending to a 10 to 15-mile radius. The pilot and an officer in the rear seat scanned the terrain to locate the 1956 Ford or any similarly sized object stuck in the forest, overturned in a ditch, or lying in open land that ground teams could not quickly reach. From the air, they carefully swept open clearings, slide slopes, hunter trails, and any unusually displaced grass patches. However, after 3 passes at different observation angles, no sign of the Ford appeared, no metallic glint from the frame, no vehicle shadow under tree canopies, and no ground area disturbed enough to suggest a vehicle had left the main road. While the plane continued searching, ground teams were redirected to check abandoned lots once used as temporary parking during hunting season. These lots were scattered on the outskirts of town, many without main road access and only reachable via seasonal tracks created by hunters' trucks. The search team carried old Ranger topographic maps to access each site. At the lot west of Gallatin Forest, they found only old, dried, and unidentifiable tire tracks, clearly not from an older car like the 1956 Ford. The northern and eastern lots also showed no signs of recent vehicle entry. Dry weather, loose soil, and strong winds meant that if a vehicle had moved at night, some traces might remain, but every observed soil sample showed no fresh disturbance. In deeper forest areas, the team reached natural steep sections commonly used by locals to drive vehicles close to the forest edge during deer season. A few areas had wide indented ruts, but the shape indicated large trucks rather than a sedan like the Ford. Moreover, there were no debris, no drag marks, and no items suggesting a vehicle or occupant had stopped there recently. When expanding the search beyond Townsend, Sheriff Tom assigned 2 officers to check outbound state routes, including the southern road to Helena, the western road connecting to sparsely populated farms, and the eastern road running near the Montana border before leading into neighboring county dirt roads. The goal was to determine whether any vehicle had been seen leaving Townsend on the night of the disappearance. They stopped at the only gas station at the intersection near town. The attendant reported no blue Ford stopping for fuel between 8 p.m. and midnight. Long-haul drivers passing through the area also reported no unusual stopped or parked vehicles on dark road segments. The northern route check, with its many side roads to old farms, likewise showed no sign of a sedan leaving town. Along each route, officers inspected sections where a vehicle might have stalled or rolled into a ditch, but found nothing noteworthy beyond some fallen wood and empty cans. The eastern road check passing through open land before skirting the lake edge also yielded no results. Although the dirt road here was softer and more likely to retain tracks, no tire patterns matched Eleanor's vehicle model. All were distorted ruts from produce trucks traveling during the week. In the comprehensive expanded search report, police recorded a pivotal fact. No evidence indicated the 1956 Ford left Townsend via any conventional route. This complicated the hypothesis of the victim voluntarily driving away, because if Eleanor had driven in dark nighttime conditions, it would be extremely difficult for her vehicle to vanish completely without leaving any sign on any observed route, whether from the air or ground. Sheriff Tom's official conclusion for the third search phase was no vehicle located, no new physical evidence beyond the blue fabric fragment, and no reports from gas stations, rest stops, or roadside residents confirming the Ford's appearance during the relevant time frame. The town-wide expanded search phase ended without any new breakthrough, forcing police to reconsider all feasible directions and contemplate that if Eleanor left by vehicle, her path of travel did not lie along the routes swept during this phase. After completing the expanded search phase without obtaining any new traces related to Eleanor or the 1956 Ford, Sheriff Tom moved to the step of compiling the entire 1959 investigation file to evaluate the completeness of the evidence and determine the next course of action. All information gathered in the first 10 days was reorganized into 3 main groups: witness statements, physical evidence collected at the scene, and field search results. Witness statements included 3 prominent facts. Mrs. Florence Cobb heard loud sounds inside the Witford house around 9 p.m. Mr. Trebe, Dale Marin heard a car door close and engine start around the time matching Eleanor's last sighting. And Harold, the husband, had changed his statement 3 times regarding the timing and possibility of Eleanor leaving the house. However, all 3 sources remained indirect. No one saw Eleanor leave the house, no one saw her enter a vehicle, and no direct witness confirmed the Ford's activity on the night of the disappearance. The second group was physical evidence, only 1 blue fabric fragment found near the lake area, but with no clear indication it belonged to Eleanor. No torn clothing, no personal items left behind, no footprints or physical signs of the backyard or trail suggesting the victim had moved through there. The failure of the scent dogs to find a trail further reinforced the lack of direct physical evidence around the Witford property. The third group was search results. 3 search phases covering from the backyard to routes leading out of town, including aerial observation by plane, all reached the same conclusion. No sign of Eleanor, no sign of the vehicle, and no secondary scene revealing additional information about the victim's movement. Although some faint tire tracks were noted, they were not clear enough to identify as belonging to the 1956 Ford or another vehicle, nor sharp enough to determine timing. When all evidence was placed side by side, Sheriff Tom and Deputy Earl had to confront 2 core issues: no body and no vehicle. These were the 2 key elements needed to shift the case from missing person to suspected criminal. The absence of a body prevented police from determining whether the victim suffered an accident, was attacked, or left voluntarily. The absence of the vehicle left every movement-related hypothesis at the level of speculation. In the context of 1959 search technology limitations, the inability to scan deep under Canyon Ferry Lake or deploy underwater metal detectors left some critical areas inaccessible in a thorough manner. Police also reevaluated Harold's statement file. The multiple changes in his account certainly raised suspicion, but there was no physical evidence to prove his involvement in Eleanor's disappearance. The inconsistencies in his statements were insufficient to establish legal grounds for opening a criminal file, especially with no signs of violence in the house, no witness hearing cries for help, and no physical traces proving a conflict occurred before Eleanor vanished. Sheriff Tom's summary report stated clearly that the available information did not yet meet the criteria for a criminal case, and concluded that continued investigation under the current circumstances was not feasible. Officers involved in the search were instructed to finalize their last notes, logging time, locations, and areas checked. The evidence file, including the blue fabric fragment, scene photographs, tire track notes, and witness statements, was sealed per standard procedure. After a comprehensive evaluation meeting, Sheriff Tom made the official decision to close the Eleanor Witford missing person file under the classification Missing Person, No Leads, meaning no viable leads existed to continue the investigation at that time. This decision was communicated internally and archived in Broadwater County records, marking the end of the 1959 investigation phase in complete deadlock, as every feasible direction had been checked, but provided no answers to Eleanor's disappearance and that of her Ford vehicle. After the Eleanor Witford file was officially closed at the end of 1959, under the classification Missing Person, No Leads, all related documents were transferred to Broadwater County's archive, storage per the procedures of that era. The archive was a small room behind the old police building, where hundreds of files were stacked in cardboard boxes or wooden shelves without a scientific classification system. Eleanor's file containing statement transcripts, search maps, ranger reports, Sheriff Tom's notes, and an envelope with the blue fabric fragment was placed in a general case box with other missing person cases from the 1950s. In the early 1960s, the file remained in its original position, but archive storage conditions were poor, seasonal humidity fluctuations, rapid paper discoloration, and some documents shifted or mixed with other cases during staff shelf reorganization. One search log lost its corner note page, several scene report pages detached from their clips, and the initial search area map faded in multiple spots. Nevertheless, core documents such as witness statements and the investigation summary remained intact, though Sheriff Tom's handwritten notes gradually lightened over time. Throughout the next 3 decades, from the 1960s to the late 1980s, no individual or agency submitted a formal request to reopen the case, partly due to no new information, partly because the case was not linked to any other active crimes in the area. It was not considered a priority. Townsend was also a small town where investigative resources typically focused on current cases rather than old files. A few elderly residents occasionally mentioned Eleanor as one of the town's enduring mysteries, but the event gradually faded into time, becoming more of an oral story than a case that could restart an investigation. In the late 1970s, when Sheriff Tom retired, file handover went to his successor, but no changes occurred regarding the Eleanor case because it was marked inactive and generated no new tasks. During periodic reviews, some old files were recatalogued, but the Eleanor case remained in the no leads group. However, one single component in the entire file showed that suspicion had never fully vanished: Deputy Earl Maddox's personal notebook. Although not an official document, the notebook was found in the case box, possibly placed there by him during a pre-retirement review. In it, he recorded several observations not included in the 1959 reports, the unusual changes in Harold's statements, the feeling that the timing of Eleanor's disappearance did not fit her usual routine, and the detail about the car door sound that he believed could not be ignored, even without accompanying physical evidence. These notes were insufficient to open a criminal file at the time, but they reflected a personal assessment. Earl believed this disappearance was not simply a woman leaving town without a trace. Still, with no body, no vehicle, no new evidence, and no additional witnesses, Earl's notes lay quietly in the file for decades, never reviewed by any authority. From the 1990s to the mid-2000s, as Montana began partially digitizing police records, the Eleanor case was not transferred to the new system due to inconsistent document condition and no request to reopen. The old report pages faded further, some loose note sheets disappeared due to decay or loss during reorganization, and the Eleanor Witford missing person file gradually became an aged document bundle on a high shelf, virtually untouched. By 2006, 47 years after Eleanor vanished, the entire file was still listed in cold case inventories, but with no supplemental investigative activity, no new witnesses emerging, and no additional information altering its deadlock status. Deputy Earle's notes remain silent like an unverified fragment of doubt, reflecting the limitations of 1959 investigative work, and opening a nearly half-century gap in the quest for the truth about Eleanor Witford's disappearance. In early 2007, Montana experienced an unusually dry winter with snowfall well below the multi-year average, causing Canyon Ferry Lake's water level to drop to a point not recorded in over 3 decades. By April, continuous strong winds combined with rapid evaporation exposed large stretches of previously submerged land and rock. This phenomenon drew the attention of many local fishermen who frequently visited the lake area as fishing season began. It was in this unusual context that a crucial discovery occurred, marking the turning point in the Eleanor Witford missing person case after nearly half a century of obscurity. On a weekend morning, Townsend residents took a small boat to the southeast part of the lake, where receding water revealed a wide mud flat. While moving along the water's edge, one of them spotted a dull, curved, metallic object lodged under thick mud. At first they thought it might be industrial debris washed down from upstream. But when they saw the object's size was larger than expected and the exposed metal had a frame-like shape, they immediately suspected something unusual. One jumped into the mud for a closer look and discovered the metal edge curved similarly to an old car's fender. Realizing the find might relate to an old accident or a long-buried object, they called the Broadwater County Sheriff's Office. The current sheriff, who had succeeded several generations of leadership since Sheriff Tom's time, dispatched a team to the scene along with the Lake Rescue Unit to assess the situation. Upon arrival, visual observation showed a large object partially submerged in mud, but the exact vehicle type could not be determined. The rescue team used steel probes and quickly realized the entire object was a solid structure, roughly the length of a sedan, with the frame heavily corroded from decades of submersion. Concluding it was likely a long-sunken vehicle, they prepared a winch and pulley extraction plan, using 2 motorized boats for stability. Pulling the vehicle took nearly 2 hours due to the wheels being deeply embedded in hard mud and the body unevenly buried. As the murky water parted to either side, the vehicle's shape became clearer. It was an old 2-door sedan, paint almost entirely gone, but the frame and lines were sufficient for the rescue team to recognize the style typical of 1950s production models. After the car was fully extracted and placed on dry ground, police officers checked the remaining VIN on the door hinge and engine compartment. Though many characters were faded or rusted, enough digits remained to cross-reference archived records. The result matched information from an old missing person file, the 1956 Ford owned by Eleanor Witford, who disappeared in 1959. The news immediately shocked everyone present at the scene, as the vehicle had been the key missing element for nearly 50 years. Upon closer external inspection, officers noted the right front door was locked, the left door handle broken but closed, and the windshield long cracked. Thick mud clogged every gap, making door opening difficult. The technical team had to use metal cutting tools to access the cabin. Inside remained only seat frames and rotted fabric scraps, too degraded to identify. No personal items could be collected immediately. Most had decomposed. When checking the trunk, they found the lid could not be opened due to rusted lock. Only after prying with a crowbar did the trunk pop open, revealing a sight that made the entire on-site team freeze for several seconds. Inside were human skeletal remains, partially covered by dried mud, but sufficiently intact to recognize the posture. The skeleton was curled, as if placed in the trunk in a sideways lying position. Not a natural posture from a vehicle entering the water. The area was immediately cordoned off, and the Broadwater County Forensics team was called to collect bone samples and conduct initial analysis. Although identity could not be confirmed on-site, no one on the team doubted that these remains were highly likely those of Eleanor Witford, who vanished along with her 1956 Ford in 1959. Upon returning to the cabin for another check, an officer found a small item wedged in the passenger side seat crack, protected from most decomposition by its tight position. It was an old handkerchief embroidered with the letters EW in one corner. Though the fabric had faded and threads in places, the embroidered characters remained clear enough to identify. This evidence was immediately collected per forensic protocol and regarded as the strongest on-scene link connecting the vehicle and remains to the long-ago missing person. Once extraction was complete, The entire vehicle was transported to the forensics facility for deeper analysis. At the scene, the investigative team recorded several key details. The vehicle's position was several dozen yards from shore, at a depth previously difficult to survey without modern detection technology. The car did not lie in a straight plunge position but tilted askew, as if pushed or slid from a point other than a normal driving path. And the lake bottom area where the vehicle rested showed no signs of heavy impact, implying low entry speed, or that the vehicle did not enter under its own power. All these details were added to the initial report, marking the moment when part of the truth buried under the lake for nearly half a century finally surfaced. The discovery of the 1956 Ford, along with the remains and the EW handkerchief, immediately opened a new phase in the Eleanor Witford missing person case, as these were the first physical pieces of evidence to appear since 1959, compelling authorities to re-examine the entire cold case long thought permanently forgotten. Immediately after the 1956 Ford and the remains were recovered from Canyon Ferry Lake, all evidence was transferred to the Broadwater County Forensics Lab under strict investigative team supervision. The analysis process was divided into multiple parallel phases to ensure every piece of data obtained could be cross-referenced with the 1959 missing person file. The first phase focused on the skeletal remains found in the trunk. Forensic pathologists cleaned the bone samples using mud removal and impurity elimination methods, then mounted the bone fragments on fixed supports to reconstruct posture and identify any perimortem injuries. Upon examining the skull, the examiner noted a long fracture running from the temporal region toward the back of the head, showing signs of blunt force trauma. The characteristics of the fracture indicated it occurred while soft tissue was still present, meaning ante mortem and was inconsistent with injuries from a vehicle submersion. On the ribs, several locations showed old, unhealed fractures, indicating the victim had suffered significant force impact but not immediately fatal. The neck and spine showed no signs of impact trauma from a vehicle plunge, reinforcing the hypothesis that the victim died before the car entered the lake. After bone analysis, the forensics team shifted to the vehicle frame to determine how the 1956 Ford entered the lake. The front right side of the vehicle was lightly dented, but there were no signs of heavy impact with rocks or the lake shore, indicating the car did not plunge at high speed. The body was tilted to one side while submerged, reflecting a sliding direction rather than a straight dive. Upon closer inspection, technicians discovered scratch marks along the rear frame, with the metal surface showing unusual convex-concave deformations, a typical pattern when the vehicle was subjected to external pushing or pulling force before entering the water. These scratch patterns were inconsistent with a simple accident and resembled marks from a hard object pressing against the frame. The mechanical forensics team examined the transmission and parking brake system. Despite severe corrosion in many components, the basic position of the gear shift indicated the vehicle was in low gear, not neutral. When the parking brake mechanism was disassembled for inspection, it showed the brake had been engaged prior to submersion. This ruled out the possibility of the car rolling into the lake due to forgotten brake application or natural slope. No locations on the body showed severed brake lines or mechanical failure. The mechanical forensics team's conclusion was that the vehicle could not have moved into the lake on its own without external intervention. This was one of the most critical pieces of data because it completely eliminated the possibility of a natural accident. In parallel with the mechanical analysis, the biological forensics team collected DNA samples from the remains to confirm identity. Although the skeleton had been underwater for decades, sufficient marrow remained in the femur for DNA extraction. The extracted sample was compared to DNA obtained from a personal item of Eleanor Witford, preserved in the old file, a wooden comb found in her belongings in 1959. The high degree of match confirmed the remains belonged to Eleanor, resolving the 48-year question about the victim's fate. Identity confirmation allowed the investigative team to examine all evidence recovered from the vehicle cabin. Upon re-examining photographs of the embroidered EW handkerchief found wedged in the passenger seat crack, forensics determined the handkerchief was remarkably well preserved for its age, thanks to its location in a part of the vehicle less penetrated by water. The embroidery thread showed color and stitching style consistent with the sewing habits Eleanor's sister had confirmed she used. No blood was present on the handkerchief, but its discovery position deeply lodged under the passenger seat made it strong evidence that Eleanor had been inside the cabin before the car submerged. Analysis continued to focus on establishing the sequence of events. Examiners determined that the remains found in the trunk could not have moved into that position during submersion. The curled posture and mud distribution indicated the body was placed in the trunk before the vehicle entered the water. No binding materials remained, but in a decades-long aquatic environment, materials such as cloth ropes or thin cords would easily decompose completely. Forensics concluded the victim died before being placed in the vehicle, based on the skull fracture and the absence of signs of water inhalation in the lungs. This indicated the victim did not drown, but died from trauma prior to the car's submersion. After completing forensic analysis, the summary report showed the 1956 Ford did not result from a spontaneous accident. The vehicle did not roll on its own. The frame showed signs of being pushed. The parking brake was engaged. The victim died before the car entered the water, and DNA confirmed the victim's identity. These conclusions constituted strong evidence compelling Montana authorities to re-examine the Eleanor Witford disappearance from an entirely new perspective. No longer a no-leads missing person case, but a death with indications of human involvement. After completing the 2007 forensic analysis and conclusions showing the 1956 Ford could not have plunged into the lake on its own, the victim died before submersion, and the vehicle showed signs of being pushed. The investigative team began the phase of reconstructing the full timeline of the night Eleanor Witford disappeared in 1959. The primary goal was to cross-reference modern forensic data with records from the old file, assess the feasibility of movement from the house to Canyon Ferry Lake, evaluate lighting conditions, weather, vehicle speed, and especially verify whether the hypothesis of the victim driving herself into the lake had any realistic basis. The first step in timeline reconstruction was comparing the 1959 statement timestamps with forensic data from the vehicle. According to neighbor Florence Cobb's statement, loud noises inside the Witford house were heard sometime after 9 p.m., followed by prolonged silence. Shortly afterward, witness Dale Marin heard a car door close and engine start briefly before shutting off. With 2007 data showing the victim died from trauma before the car entered the water, the team determined the interval between the loud noises and the car door engine sounds could correspond to the time the fatal injury occurred. The 2007 bone examination confirmed the victim's skull fracture was antemortem and inconsistent with vehicle accident trauma. This indicated the fatal event happened inside or near the house, not during travel. When cross-referenced with Harold's 1959 statements, his changing accounts about when Eleanor left and inability to precisely explain why she went out further clarified that the hypothesis of Eleanor voluntarily leaving did not align with physical evidence. The next step involved calculating travel feasibility from the Witford house to the vehicle's discovery location. From the house to the submerged position via trail and dirt roads took approximately 12 to 15 minutes of driving, depending on speed and road conditions. In 1959, Townsend had no street lighting. Nighttime drivers relied entirely on headlights. However, vehicle frame inspection showed the parking brake was engaged before submersion, meaning the vehicle was stationary before being pushed or acted upon. This ruled out the car plunging while in motion. If the driver actively controlled the vehicle, the parking brake would have been released. Its engagement indicated the vehicle was secured, most likely stopped at the lake edge, then pushed or subjected to external force to enter the water. This analysis made the self-driving hypothesis implausible. The team continued cross-referencing weather conditions that night. Strong winds blowing in from the lake, low temperatures, and dry ground made controlled nighttime driving, without leaving traces, highly unlikely. A normal driver would have kept headlights on throughout travel. However, no witnesses reported seeing moving headlights toward the lake around the time Eleanor was believed to have left, except for one single witness who saw faint vehicle lights later, without confirming direction. If Eleanor had driven in an agitated or uncontrolled state, it would have been extremely difficult for her to reach the exact later discovered location without drawing significant attention from residents near dirt roads. 1959 road conditions, especially at night, did not permit completely discreet driving. When analyzing travel direction, the team used old maps and route simulations to assess the feasibility of the vehicle being driven to the lake edge. Conclusions showed the only route placing the 1956 Ford at the discovery position was the narrow, eastern dirt road along the lake, which lacked sufficient slope for the car to roll even with brake failure, and certainly could not cause self-plunge with the parking brake engaged. All calculations confirmed external force was required. Either someone pushed the vehicle or used another vehicle or hard object to apply sufficient force to send the front end into the water. This matched the long slide and scratch marks on the rear frame discovered by forensics. The team then cross-referenced transmission status. The vehicle was found in low gear, not neutral. This meant the driver had stopped or deliberately placed it in gear to secure it before engaging the parking brake. In a self-driving scenario, no logical reason existed for her to stop, engage the parking brake, and shift into gear before plunging, especially if intending to leave town or in a panicked state. Forensic data showed this control behavior was deliberate, not impulsive or suicidal. Positioning the vehicle stably, then subjecting it to external force produced the posture found in 2007. Additionally, the team simulated entry speed into the water. Based on the vehicle's tilt angle and mud embedment depth, it did not fall at high speed. Instead, it slid from low elevation, as if pushed from the edge. No signs of hard braking or sudden acceleration appeared on the near-edge slope, a clear refutation of accidental plunge. With all synthesized data death before water entry, parking brake engaged, low gear position, rear frame scratches, insufficient slope for rolling, and complete silence along routes, the team concluded Eleanor did not drive herself to Canyon Ferry Lake. The vehicle's presence underwater in a placed rather than plunged posture proved the movement was not carried out by the victim. Any hypothesis involving Eleanor voluntarily leaving had no remaining basis. Cross-referencing 2007 forensics with the 1959 timeline revealed a coherent sequence. The victim died near the time of loud house noises. The body was placed in the trunk shortly after. The vehicle was driven by someone else, and the vehicle was brought to the lake edge under controlled conditions before being pushed in. The reconstructed timeline showed this was not a natural disappearance or accident, but a deliberate sequence of actions carried out on the night Eleanor vanished. When the reconstructed timeline confirmed the victim did not leave voluntarily and the vehicle could not have plunged on its own, the investigation direction necessarily returned to the only person present in the house with Eleanor that night, Harold Witford. The 2007 investigative team began by cross-referencing all of Harold's old 1959 statements in the file with the inconsistencies recorded across multiple interrogation sessions before the case was closed. In his initial statement, Harold said he went to bed early and did not know when Eleanor left. In the second, he suggested she might have stepped out after an unpleasant conversation. And in the third, when confronted with witness accounts of car door sounds, he said she might have gone to the car to get something. Placing these three versions side by side, the team noted inconsistencies in timing, reasons for leaving, and vehicle status, forming an unusually shifting statement pattern. The instability over time was assessed as a sign Harold may have attempted to conceal part of the truth or restructure the narrative to fit questioning pressure. Next, investigators retrieved archived local hospital records preserved on microfilm from the 1960s onward. Among them, they found a 1960 entry showing Harold had been treated for right-hand trauma, a deep laceration, and minor bone fracture. When compared to 1959 police records, no mention existed of Harold being injured around the time of Eleanor's disappearance. This immediately raised questions. Why did Harold sustain serious hand trauma mere months after Eleanor vanished, yet never report any related incident? Hospital data did not specify cause, only noting Harold claimed work accident. No witnesses confirmed, and Harold never mentioned it in subsequent years. Although this document alone could not conclude anything, the team recorded it as a significant indicator, as hand injuries are consistent with struggles or unusual vehicle handling. In parallel with medical record review, the team re-examined Harold's social relationships and marital context in 1959 from an investigative standpoint, not moral judgment, to identify possible motive. Some old acquaintances, now elderly or no longer in Montana, were contacted about Harold and Eleanor's relationship. While most described them as an ordinary couple, a few recalled financial stress periods and occasional major evening arguments. A coworker from Harold's shop recalled that in 1958, Harold frequently complained about family burdens and lack of understanding, though this information was treated cautiously due to elapsed time and potential memory distortion. When probing for possible extramarital relationships based on long-standing town rumors, the team reviewed names appearing in Deputy Earle's old notes. One woman who worked at the general store at the time was identified as someone Harold interacted with regularly. However, when interviewed, she was now nearly 80. She denied any romantic involvement, recalling Harold only as a regular customer. No direct evidence was found, but the team concluded internal family conflict could not be ruled out. Another key aspect in evaluating Harold was his behavior after Eleanor's 1959 disappearance. Old records showed Harold participated minimally in searches after the first 2 days, Contrary to typical relative behavior in missing person cases, his failure to follow up with police after the initial report, provide additional leads, or mention Eleanor in later years made the team view this as abnormal. A retired officer who worked under Sheriff Tom stated Harold never came to the station to inquire after the first week. This puzzled many in law enforcement at the time, but lack of evidence prevented further action. The team also analyzed psychological factors from Harold's post-event behavior. In the first year after Eleanor vanished, Harold continued living in the old house before moving in 1961 to another town about 50 miles away. This move occurred quickly, only months after he took a new job. Harold did not sell the house conventionally, but left it vacant for a long period, prompting modern investigators to question motives for leaving Townsend. In any disappearance, abrupt residence changes by close relatives can reflect a desire to sever ties with the old scene. Additionally, the 2007 team reviewed Harold's post-1959 tax and financial records, discovering a minor 1962 real estate transaction transferring ownership of land belonging to Eleanor's family, with no specific recorded reason. Although financial data from that era was incomplete, this indicated Harold managed family assets independently soon after active investigations ceased. These behavioral analyses were not direct evidence, but in the context of new forensics proving death before water entry and non-self movement of the vehicle. Harold's inconsistent behaviors became a central focus requiring deeper evaluation. The team concluded Harold had the highest opportunity to interact with Eleanor at the time of fatal injury, the only access to the vehicle, and the only person indirectly suspected in Deputy Earle's old notes. All these factors were documented in the 2007 report as grounds for considering criminal responsibility if supplemental evidence could establish a direct link between Harold and Eleanor Witford's death. Once investigators completed analysis of Harold's statements, behavior, and context, the next step was connecting all obtained evidence, including skeletal forensics, 1956, Ford mechanical analysis, 1959 reconstructed timeline, inconsistent statement chain, concealment indicators, and Deputy Earle's personal notebook suspicions to build an overall behavioral crime model. This phase did not aim to create speculative hypotheses, but to determine whether all facts converged into the most logical scenario of what happened the night Eleanor Witford vanished. First, skeletal forensics showed the victim suffered skull trauma before death, not from vehicle submersion accident. The skull fracture was characteristic of direct blunt impact with a hard object, not inertial impact from sinking. Rib fracture showed old, unhealed breaks consistent with trauma while alive. All indicated violence occurred before the body was placed in the trunk. This directly eliminated both 1959 hypotheses, voluntary departure and unintentional accident. Next, vehicle analysis showed the 1956 Ford was in a controlled state before entering a lake. Transmission in low gear, parking brake engaged, cabin doors closed, frame with long push-like scratches. These elements fit a scenario of external intervention, not operation-driven plunge. Combined with the vehicle's position a suitable distance from shore indicating no rolling and low-height entry mechanism, this was evidence of staging rather than accident. When forensic and vehicle data were placed alongside the reconstructed timeline, the event sequence became clearer. The loud noises Florence heard after 9 p.m. corresponded to the likely time of fatal injury. Subsequent silence fit the period for scene cleanup or body movement. The car door close and brief engine start then stop matched temporary vehicle startup to place the body in the trunk and prepare movement. Notably, witness accounts recorded no prolonged vehicle departure sound, only a short burst, consistent with the perpetrator shutting off the engine immediately after starting, possibly to avoid detection. Cross-referencing this timeline with Harold's 1959 statements revealed major discrepancies. Harold claimed he went to bed early, yet could not explain the neighbor-heard car door. Harold said Eleanor might have gone out over family matters, but forensics proved she did not leave voluntarily. Statement changes across interrogations from not knowing where his wife went, to mentioning a mild argument, to suggesting she went to the car indicated attempts to reconstruct the story to fit witness input rather than initial consistency. These inconsistencies were analyzed per criminal investigation statement evaluation standards and viewed as concealment behavior. Examining Harold's post-event conduct, minimal search participation, no follow-up on investigation progress, leaving town just 2 years later, transferring Eleanor-related family property, the team recognized a pattern common in perpetrators seeking to sever ties with the original scene. While not direct legal evidence, in the overall forensic context, they carried significant investigative weight. Another key element was Deputy Earle's personal notes. Though unofficial, his notebook recorded suspicion of Harold from the outset, shifting statements, demeanor when reporting the disappearance, and especially Harold appearing calmer than normal per Earle's assessment. In the diary, Earle noted he believed Eleanor did not leave voluntarily because every scene sign was too clean and showed no hasty behavior. At the time, lack of forensic technology prevented proof, but when cross-referenced with 2007 data, Earle's observations aligned strikingly with scientific conclusions. No footprints, no dropped items, no evidence of victim self-directed action. To construct the crime behavioral model, investigators used multi-layer analysis: opportunity, means, motive, post-event behavior. Harold was the only person with opportunity to interact with Eleanor at the time of fatal injury, as the two young children were asleep and no one else was in the house. Regarding means, Harold could operate the 1956 Ford and move it to the lake unnoticed at late hour. Frame evidence required significant pushing force, feasible for an adult like Harold, especially if the vehicle was pre-secured and adjusted. Regarding motive, though no specific cause was identified, records of marital conflict, financial pressure, and Harold's prior year complaints indicated possible family discord. Finally, post-event behavior limited cooperation with investigation, leaving town. No long-term search involvement formed a pattern matching avoidance typical of someone directly linked to the victim's death. When all forensic, timeline, statement, behavioral, and historical data were aligned in one model, the team concluded the entire sequence of events that night could only occur with active involvement from another person. The reconstructed crime behavioral model showed a deliberate chain, inflicting fatal injury, concealing the body by placing it in the trunk, nighttime vehicle movement along discrete routes, securing the vehicle at the lake edge, pushing it into the water to erase traces, and returning home without creating an obvious scene. These conclusions were not based on a single factor, but on the integrated whole of scientific evidence and historical facts, a closed logical chain, bringing the investigation to the step of identifying the central figure directly linked to Eleanor Witford's death. When the crime behavioral model was completed, and the entire chain of evidence from forensics, mechanical analysis, timeline, and inconsistent statements all pointed to the same conclusion, the investigative team submitted the report to the Broadwater County Prosecutor's Office to request an arrest warrant for Harold Witford. The prosecutor reviewed the file, including the 2007 forensic conclusions, physical evidence from the 1956 Ford, Deputy Earle's historical notes, and behavioral analysis in the 1959 context, then determined that although the crime occurred nearly half a century earlier, the current evidence was strong enough to prove intentional lethal conduct. On that basis, the prosecutor's office prepared the warrant application for the Montana court, presenting that Harold had the sole opportunity at the scene, post-event behavior indicative of concealment, and forensics confirming the death was not accidental. The Broadwater County judge signed the arrest warrant in early October 2007, directing law enforcement to apprehend Harold at his current residence, a small town about 100 miles from Townsend, where he had lived quietly for decades. The execution team consisted of 3 investigators, a local sheriff, and a representative from the prosecutor's office. They planned the approach according to protocol for a suspect who might resist or destroy evidence. On the early morning of execution, the team approached Harold's house, a small wooden-roofed home in a quiet suburban area. When Harold stepped out to the yard to retrieve the newspaper, officers emerged from 2 directions, identified themselves and their purpose, and ordered him to raise his hands for safety control. Harold appeared surprised and initially denied understanding the reason for the arrest, but upon hearing the warrant read and the legal basis related to Eleanor Witford's death in 1959, he stood still and did not resist, his eyes showing a mix of shock and wariness. After handcuffing Harold per procedure, the officers placed him in the patrol vehicle for transport back to Townsend. Meanwhile, the remaining team executed the search warrant on his home, focusing on seizing items and documents that could support prosecution, personal records, old correspondence, financial documents from 1958 and 1965, and any notes related to Eleanor. Several boxes vaguely labeled family, bills, old car were inspected per protocol. Collected items included pay stubs, vehicle repair invoices from 1958 to 1959, and several undated notes. More importantly, the team seized old photographs of Harold and Eleanor not for forensic purposes but to support contextual presentation at trial. Harold's home contained no weapons, no signs of document destruction, and no direct crime scene evidence, which was reasonable given nearly 50 years had passed. Nevertheless, seizing the records provided prosecutors with additional historical data on Harold's behavior, finances, and relationship during the period close to the victim's disappearance. After being transported to Broadwater County, Harold was formally notified of the charges. The prosecutor's office decided to charge him with second-degree murder, based on the conclusion that the lethal conduct was intentional but lacked evidence of premeditation, sufficient for first-degree murder. The indictment described the sequence: inflicting fatal injury on the victim, concealing the body by placing it in the trunk, driving the vehicle out of town, and pushing the car into the lake to erase traces. Prosecutors emphasized that the 2007 forensics were the pivotal factor proving the death could not have been accidental, and the reconstructed timeline eliminated any possibility of the victim driving herself. When the indictment was read, Harold remained silent, only stating that he didn't remember anything about that night, a claim that further highlighted inconsistencies with his prior statements. He was transferred to the county jail pending the first hearing, while the investigative team finalized the final report for submission to the court. The arrest of Harold Witford, carried out quietly but decisively, marked the first time in nearly half a century that an individual was held legally accountable for Eleanor Witford's disappearance and death, closing the investigation phase and opening the criminal prosecution process under Montana state law. The trial of Harold Witford was held in Helena, the capital of Montana, which had the capacity to handle serious cases and complex historical files. From early morning on opening day, the courtroom was packed, mostly with Townsend residents and those who had known about Eleanor Witford's 1959 disappearance. The prosecutor opened with a long and systematic presentation, stressing that the case rested not on speculation, but on three inseparable pillars: 2007 forensics, the reconstructed 1959 timeline based on witnesses, and physical evidence from the 1956 Ford. Prosecutors pointed out that forensics established the victim died from skull trauma before the car submerged, that the body was placed in the trunk, not self-moved, that the vehicle was secured with the parking brake and low gear, incapable of rolling on its own, and that the frame showed signs of being pushed, completely eliminating the accident hypothesis. Prosecutors then presented the timeline loud noises in the Witford house after 9 p.m., the suspicious silence that followed, the car door close and brief engine start then stop. When cross-referenced with the victim's injury and the necessary journey to the lake, prosecutors asserted this sequence fit a perpetrator inflicting fatal injury, handling the body briefly, placing it in the trunk, and moving the vehicle to Canyon Ferry Lake that night. Key evidence included the embroidered EW handkerchief and the remains position in the trunk, presented as proof that Eleanor had been in the Ford under non-voluntary conditions. Prosecutors did not overlook concealment behavior. Harold's three changing statements in 1959, his minimal participation in the search for his wife in the early days, his departure from town only 2 years later, and his failure to follow up with police on the investigation's progress. Prosecutors specifically cited Deputy Earle's diary page, in which he recorded suspicion of Harold's statements on the very night of the disappearance, a suspicion proven well-founded by forensics 48 years later. After the prosecution's presentation, the court called the first witness, Mrs. Florence Cobb. She recounted the loud noises from the Witford house that she heard, followed by unusual silence. Prosecutors questioned her on timing and volume to reinforce the forensic timeline. The second witness, Mr. Dale Marin, described the car door close and brief engine sound matching the forensic timing for body movement. Forensic experts were called next. The bone forensics expert described the skull fracture as one that could only result from strong blunt force, impossible from a vehicle plunge accident. He also presented 3D skull reconstruction images showing the force direction from the side. The vehicle mechanics expert explained that the Ford could not have rolled on its own, parking brake engaged, low gear and lake position inconsistent with accident. He provided a force simulation model required to push the vehicle into the water from the edge of force an adult could generate if the vehicle was stationary. In cross-examination, the defense attorney emphasized the extreme time lapse, nearly 50 years, and potential witness memory distortion. He argued the blue fabric fragment was not conclusively Eleanor's, and that frame scratches could result from rocks or lake structures during sinking. However, when prosecutors asked the expert to detail metal scratch characteristics from pulling, the expert affirmed the scratches on the frame were straight, long, and parallel, completely inconsistent with natural impact. The attorney also attempted to challenge forensics by questioning whether corrosion could have misled the brake status, but the internal mechanism expert clearly stated the parking brake was engaged while the vehicle was dry before submersion based on cable fixation. When the attorney suggested Eleanor might have driven herself but lost consciousness from prior injury, prosecutors immediately rebutted with forensics. No signs of water inhalation in the lungs, proving she was not alive when the car entered the water. Skull fracture direction inconsistent with a fall, and no evidence of self-impact with any hard object inside the vehicle. Another defense point was possible: natural sliding due to terrain, but 1959 maps and geological slope analysis presented in court showed the vehicle's entry route lacked sufficient incline for sliding, especially with the parking brake engaged. A series of defense rebuttals were countered by prosecutors with forensics, science, and physical data, weakening the cross-examination. The attorney shifted to emotional argument, stating Harold had no clear motive and that a hard-working husband could not suddenly kill his wife. Prosecutors responded by stressing that Montana law on second-degree murder does not require proving motive. Only intentional lethal conduct or reckless indifference to human life in all forensics proved intentional conduct. In closing, prosecutors presented the crime behavioral model constructed by the investigative team. Argument in the house, fatal injury, body handling, placement in trunk, TREF vehicle start, discrete route movement, lake edge arrival, parking brake and gear engagement, pushing the vehicle into the water to erase traces. Prosecutors emphasized this model was the only one consistent with all forensic, witness, and physical evidence. During deliberations, the jury was instructed to consider 3 questions. Did Eleanor die from accident or human intervention? Did the vehicle enter the lake by rolling or being pushed? And was there evidence directly linking Harold? After more than 6 hours of deliberation and closed session, the jury returned to the courtroom and the judge requested the foreperson to read the verdict. Complete silence enveloped the Helena courtroom. The jury found Harold Witford guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Eleanor Witford, based on the chain of forensic evidence, reconstructed timeline, physical evidence analysis, and decades-long concealment behavior. The judge took time to explain that although the crime occurred nearly half a century earlier, Montana law allows prosecution of serious crimes without statute of limitations, and modern scientific evidence had clarified points the 1959 system could not prove. He stressed that the vehicle could not have plunged on its own, the body could not have positioned itself in the trunk, and the victim could not have self-inflicted the fatal trauma. These elements could only occur with intervention by a living person that night. Based on the severity of the conduct causing death, handling the body, concealing by pushing the vehicle into the lake, and maintaining silence for decades, the court sentenced Harold to 20 to 40 years imprisonment under Montana's second-degree murder sentencing guidelines. When asked if he wished to make a final statement before sentencing, Harold spoke only briefly, saying he didn't remember and didn't intend it, but the judge noted that statement was inconsistent with forensic evidence and not a mitigating factor. After the sentence was pronounced, prosecutors filed a motion to officially close the Eleanor Witford missing person file, recording that identity, cause of death, body location, and perpetrator had all been established after 47 years. Eleanor's file was transferred from the cold case list to Montana's resolved list, marking the end of one of the longest-running disappearances in the region's history. The prosecutor's office summary report emphasized that the case was important proof of the role of modern forensics in solving historical files once thought untraceable. At the same time, it prompted changes in missing person file management and handling procedures in Montana. After the trial, the Montana State Police updated new guidelines stressing the importance of long-term evidence preservation, detailed statement recording, and standardized file maintenance for future reinvestigation. New training courses were implemented, using the Eleanor Witford case as a model scenario to highlight that a disappearance with no obvious traces could still be concealed, crime, and must be followed until new evidence emerges. Closing Eleanor's file held not only legal significance, but historical meaning for the Townsend community. Residents finally received an answer to the mysterious 1959 disappearance and witnessed the justice system holding accountability after nearly half a century. When the judge struck the gavel to conclude the trial, the case officially closed, leaving a profound mark on Montana law enforcement's awareness that every missing person file, no matter how old, can uncover truth when science and investigation are properly combined. The Eleanor Witford story, though it occurred in 1959, still carries many practical lessons for modern American life. especially in a society increasingly focused on personal safety, community responsibility, and the role of science in justice. Eleanor's silent disappearance, leaving no traces beyond unusual sounds heard by neighbors, reminds us of the importance of paying attention to small details in our surroundings. If witnesses at the time had shared information more openly, or if community reporting systems like today's apps had existed, the chance of detecting something abnormal might have been higher. Another detail, the disorganized storage of files, documents lost over time, shows the necessity of standardizing data archiving in law enforcement. Today, with digitization and centralized file management systems, we have the opportunity to ensure no evidence is forgotten. But Eleanor's case reminds us that good technology is only useful when people use it correctly. Additionally, Harold's multiple statement changes and lack of active participation in searching for his wife are signs that abnormal post-event behavior can be a key indicator in criminal investigations. This encourages us as individuals in the American community to stay vigilant and dare to report suspicious behavior from those close to us if it relates to someone else's safety. Finally, solving the case through modern forensics after 47 years reminds us that justice, though delayed, can still be served when society values science and persistence. The practical lesson for us is to believe in the value of truth, invest in community protection systems, and always be ready to help when someone nearby is at risk. This is how each individual can contribute to making the United States a safer and more humane place. Thank you for following the journey that brought Eleanor Witford's truth to light after nearly half a century buried. If you want to continue joining stories of justice revived through science and persistence, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next video. See you in other cold case stories where every small clue can change the entire truth.